The helicopter blades cut through the desert air like angry wasps, their rhythmic thump, thump, thump barely audible over the ringing in Marcus Rivera's ears. Blood trickled down his temple as he pressed his back against the metal wall of the aircraft, watching his teammate Jake Wilson writhe in pain on the stretcher beside him. The mission had gone sideways fast, and now they were racing against time to get Wilson to the nearest medical facility. ETA 3 minutes, the pilot shouted over the noise, his voice crackling through the comm system. Marcus looked around at his team. 8 Navy SEALs, all bearing various degrees of damage from their encounter with insurgents in the Afghan mountains. What was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission had turned into a firefight that lasted 4 hours. They'd lost contact with base, taken heavy fire, and barely made it to the extraction point, alive. The makeshift landing zone came into view, a small forward operating base carved into the mountainside. It wasn't much, but it had a medical tent, and that was all that mattered right now. Wilson was losing too much blood, and the field dressing on his leg wound wasn't holding. As the helicopter touched down, dust swirled everywhere, creating a brown cloud that made it hard to see anything clearly. Marcus grabbed one end of Wilson's stretcher, while his teammate Rodriguez took the other. They ran toward the medical tent, their boots pounding against the hard-packed earth. "Medic! We need a medic!" Marcus yelled as they burst through the tent flaps. The tent was larger than expected, with several cots lined up along the sides and medical equipment scattered on metal tables. But what caught Marcus off guard was the figure that emerged from behind a supply cabinet. A woman in scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, surgical gloves already on her hands. "Get him on the table," she said calmly, pointing to the central examination area. Her voice carried authority despite her small frame. Marcus and Rodriguez lifted Wilson onto the table, and immediately the woman went to work. She cut away his uniform pants without hesitation, exposing the ugly wound on his thigh. Her movements were precise, professional, like she'd done this 1,000 times before. "What's his blood type?" she asked, already reaching for an IV kit. "O positive," Marcus replied, watching her hands work with practiced efficiency. "Good. I've got plenty of that." She inserted the IV needle on her first try, then began cleaning the wound. "What happened out there?" "Ambush. We were pinned down for hours," Rodriguez explained, still catching his breath. The woman nodded, focused entirely on Wilson's leg. She worked quickly, but carefully, cleaning the wound, checking for debris, applying fresh pressure dressings. Marcus found himself studying her face. She was young, maybe late 20s, but she moved with the confidence of someone much older. "Is he going to be okay?" Marcus asked. "The bullet went clean through. Missed the major arteries, but he's lost a lot of blood. He'll need surgery to repair some muscle damage, but he'll live." She looked up at Marcus for the first time, and he noticed her eyes were an unusual shade of green. "What about the rest of you? Anyone else need immediate attention?" Marcus touched the cut on his temple. "Just scratches mostly. Let me be the judge of that." She gestured to a nearby cot. "Sit." Marcus hesitated. He didn't like taking orders from civilians, especially not from someone who looked like she should be working in a hospital in the suburbs, not treating wounded soldiers in a war zone. But something in her manner made him comply. She examined his head wound with gentle fingers, tilting his chin to get a better look at the gash. "This needs stitches," she said matter-of-factly. "It's fine," Marcus protested. "No, it's not." She was already preparing a suture kit. "Head wounds bleed a lot, and can get infected easily out here. Trust me, you don't want to explain to your commanding officer why you're laid up with sepsis because you were too stubborn to get a few stitches." As she worked on his forehead, Marcus studied her more closely. There was something about her that didn't add up. Her hands were steady, her technique flawless. But more than that, she wasn't rattled by any of this. Most civilian medical personnel, even experienced ones, showed some signs of stress when dealing with combat injuries. This woman was calm as ice. "You work here long?" Marcus asked, trying to make conversation. "Few months," she replied, not looking up from her work. Where'd you train? Medical school? Something like that. Her answers were short, almost evasive. Marcus felt the tug of the needle as she put in another stitch. What's your name? She paused for just a fraction of a second before answering. Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. Well, Sarah Mitchell, you're pretty good at this. Ever think about joining the military? This time she did look at him. And for just an instant, Marcus saw something flash in her eyes. Recognition. Maybe. Or familiarity with military life. But it was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. I serve where I'm needed, she said simply, returning to her work. Behind them, Wilson was starting to come around from the painkillers she'd given him. You're safe, Sarah called over without turning around. Just rest. You're going to be fine. Marcus watched her finish the last stitch on his forehead. Her technique was perfect. Neat. Even. Professional. This wasn't the work of someone who'd learned basic field medicine. This was surgical-level skill. There, she said, stepping back to admire her work. Keep it clean and dry. Come back in a few days so I can check it. Thanks, Doc, Marcus said, standing up. I'm not a doctor, she corrected quickly. Just a medic. But Marcus wasn't buying it. Everything about her. From the way she'd triaged Wilson's injuries to the precise way she'd sutured his cut. Screamed, advanced medical training. Plus, there was something else. Something in the way she carried herself that reminded him of military bearing. The tent flaps opened and Rodriguez stuck his head in. Transport's here for Wilson. They're taking him to the main hospital at Bagram. Good, Sarah said, checking Wilson's one more time. He should be stable for transport now. IT. 2. SAID. 2. As they prepared to move Wilson to the helicopter that would take him to better medical facilities, Marcus lingered. Something about Sarah Mitchell bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. Thanks for everything, he said. Really? You saved his life. Sarah was already cleaning up the medical supplies, her back to him. Just doing my job. Marcus started to leave, then turned back. Hey. Sarah? She looked up from organizing gauze packages. That suture technique you used. That's military medical corps training, isn't it? I've seen it before. For a moment, Sarah's carefully maintained composure slipped. Marcus caught a glimpse of something in her expression. Surprise. Maybe fear. But then, she recovered. Shrugging, casually. You pick up techniques from all over in this line of work, she said. Marcus nodded, but he wasn't convinced. As he left the medical tent and rejoined his team, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to Sarah Mitchell than she was letting on. The way she'd handled Wilson's injury, her calm under pressure, even the way she stood, it all pointed to military training, and not just basic field medicine. Back in the helicopter, as they flew toward their base, Marcus found his thoughts returning to the mysterious medic. Who was she, really? And why was she working in a remote forward operating base instead of a major military hospital where someone with her skills clearly belonged? He made a mental note to ask around when they got back to base. In a war zone, information about personnel was usually easy to come by, especially for someone in his position. Sarah Mitchell might think she could keep her secrets, but Marcus Rivera had spent his career uncovering things that people wanted to stay hidden. Little did he know that digging into Sarah's background would lead him down a path that would change everything he thought he knew about the woman who had just saved his teammate's life. Some secrets, he would soon learn, were kept for very good reasons. 3 days later, Marcus Rivera found himself back at the forward operating base, officially to check on his stitches, but really because he couldn't stop thinking about Sarah Mitchell. The questions that had been nagging at him since their first encounter had only grown stronger with time. He'd done some digging, and what he'd found, or rather, what he hadn't found, only deepened the mystery. According to official records, Sarah Mitchell was a civilian contractor hired through a medical staffing agency. She had the proper credentials, clearances, and paperwork. But when Marcus had quietly reached out to contacts in personnel, he'd discovered something odd. Nobody seemed to know exactly how she'd ended up at this particular base, or why someone with her obvious skills was working in such a remote location. The walk to the medical tent gave him time to think. The base was quiet in the afternoon heat, with most personnel either resting or handling routine duties. A few soldiers nodded as he passed, recognizing him from the other day. Word had spread about the firefight and Wilson's injury, as it always did in small military communities. Marcus pushed through the tent flaps and found Sarah restocking supplies from a large cardboard box. She looked up as he entered, and he caught that same fleeting look of wariness he'd noticed before. "Sergeant Rivera," she said, setting down a package of bandages. "How's the head feeling?" Good as new," Marcus replied, touching the neat line of stitches on his forehead. "Thought you might want to take a look." Sarah nodded and gestured to the same cot he'd sat on 3 days earlier. Up close, he could see small details he'd missed before: a thin scar along her jawline, partially hidden by her hair. The kind of scar that came from glass or shrapnel, not a childhood accident. "Healing nicely," she said, stepping back. "No signs of infection. I can remove the stitches in another few days." "Sarah," Marcus said carefully. Her hands stilled as she reached for a fresh package of gauze. "That first night, when we brought Wilson in, you handled that situation like you'd done it before. A lot. Combat injuries aren't something most civilian medics see regularly." "I told you. You pick up techniques from all over," she replied, but her voice was tighter than before. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I've been in the military for 12 years. I've worked with a lot of medical personnel. Field medics, doctors, surgeons, civilian contractors. You move like someone who's had combat medical training." Military combat medical training. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes studying his face as if trying to decide something. Finally, she sighed and sat down on the edge of the supply table. "What do you want me to say, Sergeant? The truth would be nice." She was quiet again, and Marcus could see her weighing her options. Outside the tent, the sounds of the base continued. Vehicles moving, voices calling to each other, the distant hum of generators. "My brother was a Marine," Sarah said finally, "deployed twice to Iraq. He used to tell me stories about the field medics, how they saved lives under impossible conditions. When he came home, he was different. PTSD, survivor's guilt, the whole package. He'd wake up screaming, thinking he was still over there." Marcus listened, recognizing the familiar story of too many veterans he'd known. "I was in nursing school at the time," Sarah continued. "I specialized in trauma medicine, partly because of what he went through. I wanted to understand what he'd experienced, help other people who'd been through the same thing." "What happened to him?" Marcus asked gently. Sarah's jaw tightened. "He didn't make it. Took his own life 2 years after he got back." "I'm sorry," Marcus said, meaning it. "After that, I couldn't just work in a regular hospital anymore. It felt insignificant. I started volunteering with veterans organizations, then got into contract work supporting military operations. This is where I felt like I could make a real difference." It was a good story, Marcus thought. Believable, even touching. But something about the way she told it felt rehearsed, like she'd told this version before, and it still didn't explain her level of skill or the way she'd moved under pressure. "That's a noble reason to be here," Marcus said. "But it doesn't explain why you handle combat injuries like you've treated them personally before, not just heard stories about them." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus got the feeling she was making some kind of decision. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder, more direct. "What would you say if I told you that sometimes people need to disappear for a while? That sometimes the best way to serve is to do it quietly, without recognition or acknowledgement?" I'd say that sounds like someone with a military background, trying very hard not to sound like they have a military background. Sarah almost smiled at that. "You're persistent. It's part of the job." "Which job is that exactly?" Because last I checked, Navy SEALs weren't investigators. Now it was Marcus's turn to pause. That was a good point. And it told him that Sarah knew more about military structure and roles than a civilian contractor probably should. Call it professional curiosity, he said. In my line of work, it pays to know who you can count on. And something tells me you're someone worth counting on, regardless of what your official paperwork says. Before Sarah could respond, the tent flaps burst open and Rodriguez stumbled in, blood running down his arm from a deep gash. Sorry to interrupt, he said, breathing hard. Had an argument with some concertina wire. The wire won. Immediately, Sarah was in motion, her manner shifting from cautious conversation to focused medical professional. Sit down, she ordered, already reaching for supplies. How did this happen? Helping string new perimeter wire, Rodriguez explained, wincing as Sarah cut away his sleeve to examine the wound. Caught my arm on a loose piece. When I was stretching it tight, Sarah examined the gash carefully, testing Rodriguez's range of motion, checking for nerve damage. Marcus watched her work, noting again the precision and confidence of her movements. You're lucky, she said to Rodriguez. It's deep, but clean. Missed all the important stuff. Going to need quite a few stitches, though. As Sarah prepared to suture Rodriguez's arm, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. When she rolled up her sleeves to avoid getting blood on them, he caught a glimpse of a tattoo on her inner wrist. Small, discreet, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. It was a medical caduceus surrounded by a small circle, with what looked like wings on either side. Marcus had seen that symbol before, though not often. It was the unofficial tattoo of a very specific, very elite military medical unit, one that officially didn't exist and whose members were sworn to secrecy about their service. Special Operations Medical Support Unit. The medics, who went into the most dangerous places with the most classified missions. They were legends in the special operations community. But their identities were protected at the highest levels of military classification. Marcus felt his heart rate increase as the implications hit him. Sarah wasn't just a former military medic. She was one of the most elite medical professionals the military had ever produced. And if she was working under an assumed identity at a remote forward operating base, there was probably a very serious reason why. He watched her finish Rodriguez's stitches with the same precise technique she'd used on him. Her face calm and focused. But now Marcus was seeing everything differently. The way she positioned herself to maintain situational awareness. How she kept her medical supplies organized for maximum efficiency. The subtle way she assessed everyone who entered her tent for threat level. This wasn't a civilian contractor with military experience. This was an operator. Just like him, but in the medical field, instead of combat operations. When she finished with Rodriguez and sent him on his way with care instructions, Marcus found himself alone with Sarah again. She was cleaning up the blood and disposing of used supplies, moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done this routine countless times. That's quite a tattoo, Marcus said quietly. Sarah's hands stopped moving. She looked down at her wrist, where the sleeve had ridden up again, exposing the small symbol. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I don't know what you think you saw, she said finally, pulling her sleeve down to cover the tattoo. I think I saw something that explains a lot about why you're really here, Marcus replied. And why someone of your caliber is working under a name that probably isn't your real one. Sarah turned to face him, and Marcus saw a new expression in her eyes. Not fear this time, but calculation. She was assessing him, deciding how much of a threat he posed to whatever operation she was really part of. Sergeant Rivera, she said slowly, there are things happening in this region that go beyond simple reconnaissance missions and routine medical support. Things that require people with specialized skills to be positioned in specific places. What kind of things? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. The kind of things that Navy SEALs are supposed to be very good at keeping quiet about. Marcus nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand that his chance encounter with Sarah Mitchell 3 days ago hadn't been chance at all. In the world of special operations, there were rarely coincidences, only carefully planned contingencies and operations within operations. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now," Sarah said, "you forget what you think you saw. And we go back to me being a civilian contractor who's just trying to do her job and help wounded soldiers." But Marcus could see in her eyes that she knew it was too late for that. He'd seen too much, figured out too much. And in the dangerous game they were both playing, that meant everything was about to change. The alert sirens shattered the pre-dawn silence like a knife through glass. Marcus bolted upright in his bunk, instantly awake and reaching for his gear. Around him, his teammates were doing the same. The practiced movements of men who'd responded to emergency calls hundreds of times before. "What's the situation?" Marcus called out as his team leader. Lieutenant Commander Hayes burst through the door. "High-value target extraction went sideways," Hayes said tersely, already strapping on his vest. "Delta team took heavy casualties. They've got wounded pinned down in hostile territory, and we're the closest extraction unit." Marcus was pulling on his boots when Hayes added something that made his blood run cold. "They've also got a medic trapped with them. Someone with specialized medical clearance who was providing support for the operation. Command wants her extracted, along with the wounded." Marcus looked up sharply. "Her? That's all I know. We move in 10 minutes. As Marcus gathered his gear, his mind raced. The timing, the location, the mention of a female medic with specialized clearance. It all pointed to one person. Sarah Mitchell, or whoever she really was, hadn't just been treating wounded soldiers at the forward operating base. She'd been positioned there as medical support for classified operations. The helicopter ride to the extraction point was tense. Intelligence reports indicated a large insurgent force had surrounded the pinned-down team in a compound about 20 miles from the base. The wounded were trapped in a building with limited ammunition and no way out. "LZ is hot," the pilot called back. "I can get you close, but you'll have to move fast." Marcus checked his weapon one final time as the mountainous terrain rushed by below them. Dawn was breaking over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris, and Marcus's team hit the ground running. They could hear gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. Sustained automatic weapons fire, punctuated by the sharp crack of sniper rifles. The fight was still very much ongoing. Hayes led them up a rocky slope toward the sound of the guns, using hand signals to coordinate their approach. As they crested a ridge, they could see the compound below, a cluster of stone buildings surrounded by insurgent positions. Muzzle flashes winked from windows and doorways, like deadly fireflies. "There," Hayes pointed to a partially collapsed building at the center of the compound. "That's where our people are." Marcus could see the tactical situation immediately. The building provided good cover, but it was surrounded. Any attempt to break out would result in casualties, which explained why the team was still pinned down hours after the operation had gone wrong. "We need to create a diversion," Hayes said into his radio. "Draw their fire away from the building so we can get our people out." What followed was a carefully orchestrated assault that Marcus had executed dozens of times before, but never with quite this much personal stake. As his team engaged the insurgent positions from multiple angles, creating the confusion and distraction needed for extraction, Marcus found himself thinking about Sarah and hoping she was still alive. The plan worked. Under cover of the diversionary attack, Hayes and 2 others managed to reach the trapped building, while Marcus and the rest of the team kept the insurgents occupied. Through his earpiece, Marcus heard Hayes's voice, calling for extraction support. "We've got 4 wounded and 1 medical officer ready for transport," Hayes reported. "Need immediate casevac for the worst injuries." 20 minutes later, they were loading the wounded onto helicopters for transport to the main medical facility at Bagram. Marcus found himself on the same aircraft as Sarah, who was unconscious and pale, blood seeping through field dressings on her shoulder and leg. But she was alive. During the flight, as the medics worked to stabilize the wounded, Marcus noticed something that confirmed his worst fears about what Sarah had really been doing. Her gear wasn't the standard equipment of a civilian contractor. She was carrying specialized medical supplies that were only issued to the most elite military medical units, advanced surgical instruments, experimental medications, emergency procedures that weren't even in the regular Army field manual. More telling, when the medics cut away her blood-soaked shirt to treat her shoulder wound, Marcus saw additional tattoos he hadn't noticed before. A small American flag on her collarbone, unit citations on her ribs, and on her back, partially visible as they worked on her, the distinctive wings and medical symbol of Air Force Pararescue Medical Specialists. Pararescue, the most elite medical operators in the entire military. The people who went behind enemy lines to rescue and treat wounded special operations personnel in the most dangerous conditions imaginable. They were part medic, part warrior, part guardian angel, and their identities were protected at the highest levels of military classification because of the nature of their missions. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just a former military medic working as a civilian contractor. She was an active-duty pararescue specialist operating under deep cover, positioned at the forward operating base to provide immediate medical support for the most classified special operations missions in the region. At Bagram, as Sarah was wheeled into surgery, Marcus found himself waiting in the corridor with the rest of his team. The wounded Delta operators were in stable condition, thanks largely to the medical care Sarah had provided while they were pinned down. According to the initial reports, she'd performed emergency surgery in the middle of a firefight, using improvised tools and working by the light of muzzle flashes. It was Hayes who finally explained the situation, pulling Marcus aside for a private conversation. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels," Hayes said quietly. "That woman you've been curious about? Her real name is Captain Sarah Elizabeth Chen, United States Air Force. She's one of only 12 active pararescue medics qualified for deep cover operations. She's been positioned at that base for 6 months as medical support for a series of classified missions targeting high-value insurgent leaders." Marcus felt the pieces falling into place. The mission that went wrong tonight was the culmination of months of intelligence gathering and preparation. Captain Chen was supposed to provide immediate medical support if anything went sideways. Which it did, obviously. "Why tell me this?" Hayes looked at him seriously. "Because your team has been selected to provide security for her recovery and return to operational status. Her cover has been blown by tonight's operation, so she'll need protection while new arrangements are made." Marcus nodded, understanding the implications. In the world of special operations, blown covers meant reassignment, new identities, and often early retirement from active duty. For someone like Sarah, Captain Chen, it might mean the end of a career she'd spent years building. 3 days later, Marcus found himself back in the medical tent at the forward operating base. This time visiting Sarah as she recovered from her surgery. Her arm was in a sling, and she moved carefully, but she was alert and back to her professional demeanor. "Sergeant Rivera," she said as he entered. "Come to check on your stitches again?" "Actually, I came to check on you," Marcus replied. "And to say thank you." Sarah looked puzzled. "For what?" "For saving those Delta operators. For doing your job under impossible conditions. And for teaching me something about assumptions." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then smiled ruefully. "I suppose there's no point in maintaining the civilian contractor story anymore." "Captain Chen," Marcus said formally. "It's been an honor." Sarah's expression grew serious. "That name doesn't exist anymore, Sergeant. After tonight, Captain Chen is being reassigned to a training position stateside. Sarah Mitchell is being retired permanently." Marcus understood. Blown covers meant burned identities. "So what happens now?" Sarah looked out through the tent opening toward the mountains beyond the base. "Now I go back to being a regular Air Force flight surgeon. No more deep cover. No more classified missions. Just regular military medicine in a regular military hospital." "That sounds pretty good, actually," Marcus said. "Safer, at least." Sarah turned back to him, and Marcus saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not wariness or calculation, but genuine warmth. You know, Sergeant, for someone who's supposedly just curious about medical procedures, you're remarkably persistent in your investigations. Marcus grinned. Like I said, it's part of the job. But I have to ask, was any of that story about your brother true? Sarah's expression grew sad. Every word. Michael Chen, United States Marine Corps. He did serve 2 tours in Iraq. And he didn't make it home in any way that mattered. His death is what made me want to do this work, to make sure other families didn't have to go through what we did. I'm sorry, Marcus said sincerely. He would have liked knowing that his story helped convince a suspicious Navy SEAL to stop asking quite so many questions. Sarah said with a small smile. First, Marcus laughed. Well, when you put it that way, I guess it served its purpose. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of the base around them. Finally, Sarah spoke again. Thank you, Marcus, for coming after us. For not giving up when things got complicated. That's what we do, Marcus replied. We don't leave people behind. No, Sarah agreed. We don't. As Marcus prepared to leave, Sarah called after him. Sergeant, when this is all over, when we're both back stateside, maybe we could grab a coffee sometime. As civilians. Marcus turned back to her, seeing not the mysterious medic or the elite pararescue operator, but simply a woman who dedicated her life to saving others at great personal cost. I'd like that, Captain. I'd like that very much. Outside the tent, the sun was setting over the Afghan mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. Tomorrow, Sarah would begin the process of returning to her regular life, leaving behind the identity that had allowed her to serve in the shadows. It was the end of one story, but Marcus had the feeling it might be the beginning of another.